Hello everyone, welcome to our video, the Road to the Revolution, or what made the revolution possible, by me, Caitlin, and Clifford, Jennifer, and Andrew. And we're going to begin with salutary neglect.
Okay, when the colonies were founded, basically the British originally adopted an unofficial policy of salutary neglect, which is basically they let the colonies defend for themselves mostly with little aid from England. They ran themselves, ran their own colonies, ran their own economies, and trade laws weren't that enforced. That was until after French and Indian War, when the British Empire went into debt and needed to pass some laws which paid for their debt at the expense of the colonies.
Alrighty, and that leads us into the Proclamation of 1763. Essentially what that meant is that colonists were no longer allowed to pass this line that I'm drawing right here very poorly. Naturally, the colonists were not happy at this at all. They wanted to continue to explore the green little circle area because that meant more wealth for them. But because of this proclamation of 1763, it led to such acts as
the Paxton Boy. You see, the Proclamation of 1763 protected Indian land, and many colonists wanted to expand westward because when the proclamation was signed, they felt encroached on. They wanted to expand, they felt it's their right. So, some of these people that rebelled so harshly was the Paxton Boys, that actually were a group of men who came in and actually destroyed an Indian village and killed all the men, women, and children in protest. 20 in total.
Alright, so now on to the acts. First off is the Sugar Act. Essentially that put a tax on sugar and molasses, which was incredibly important to English colonial life, such as making rum. Basically, this was one of the first of many acts that the British was going to use to get more money from the colonists.
Okay, and shortly after that, the Sugar Act was followed by the Currency Act, which basically prevented the British colonies from producing their own money. So basically, if they needed some dollar bills or pounds, they have to get it from the British Empire, all the way from Britain. They couldn't produce their own, So
yeah, that was the Currency Act. Now on to number 3, the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act essentially meant that if you were a British soldier, you could go to any colonial home, state that you were a British soldier, and expect to be taken care of, to be fed, to be housed, and to be watched over.
Yes, and shortly after that was the Stamp Act, which was one of the more important acts, which basically had a tax on all printed paper and stamps. If you wanted a stamp to mail your letter to your dying grandma, for an example, and you have the last of your money and you want to give it to her just to know that she loves you and everything, and you want her to be comfortable, and before she but then you realize the Stamp Act, so now all the money you put in for your grandma, you have to pay for a stamp. You can't afford the stamp, so
Grandma dies, and then
and never hears from you.
Oh, rupee.
Yes.
Alright, now onto the Stamp Act Congress, which was a direct result from the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress essentially meant that colonial people would boycott and not import any British goods until such acts like the Stamp, Sugar, and Currency Act were repealed. A notable thing about this is that it was the first kind of union, a get-together of people who would be majorly important into the coming revolution.
Yes.
Indeed.
And on to the Declaratory Act, which, when the Stamp Act was repealed, it was, the Congress most of the people were glad that was repealed. However, as a result of it, Parliament, when they repealed the Stamp Act, instead they passed another law called the Declaratory Act under the guise of the repeal, which basically stated that Parliament had all of complete authority over policies in the colonies. Basically controlled it. After the Declaratory Act came the Townshend Act, which is named after the British Prime Minister Townshend at the time. And these acts included taxes on certain goods Plus, it also allowed Britain to set up courts, vice admiralty courts, which allowed them to put to trial anybody without who like broke the law, like under the British Crown. And these taxes were very unpopular among the colonists.
Incredibly so.
Yes.
Now, the colonists were so mad, they would just try to pick on the British soldiers no matter what the case was, which is the starting of the Boston Massacre.
Yeah.
The Boston Massacre was British soldiers who shot into a crowd after a snowball fight, so the colonists were throwing snowballs at them.
And other objects.
And other objects, that's true.
They, like, panicked.
And an interesting little fact is that 2 of the 9 soldiers were defended by John Adams, and they were also found guilty of manslaughter.
Yes. Okay, and one of the results of these increasing tensions between the British and the Americans was the First Committee of Correspondence, which was founded in 1773. Okay, and the committees of correspondence, which started propping up in all of the states, were basically committees that like dealt with affairs separate from the British government, and they were addressing like local problems plus problems with the British, like with their laws and taxes that were
Unjust.
yes, like people like Benjamin Franklin were part of it.
Good people. Alrighty, now on to the tea. Alright, the Tea Act essentially meant that they put an increased tax on tea, which meant the colonists do not want to buy that, which eventually led to something called the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, and this tea act was conveniently placed after 10 shipments of tea actually arrived in America.
They really didn't like us.
Yes, so it came right before they arrived, even though tea was cheap before then. So they kind of were obligated to buy it. Now, many people did not like this, many of the colonists, including some native Bostonians who at Boston, like 50 men, including like Samuel Adams, dressed up as Indians and dumped tea off of one of the boats into the river. And that was the Boston Tea Party.
I think that was Samuel Adams, that one right there.
The harbor.
This dude right there. Yeah.
You sure?
I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong.
Okay.
On to the Intolerable Act. So the Intolerable Act was basically the British reaction to the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, this included the closing of Boston Harbor, the Quebec Act, and the
A whole bunch of other bad things, which led to the First Continental Congress, which was our response to the Intolerable Acts.
yes.
So, important people in the First Continental Congress were people that we see here, Sons of Liberty. So, we have some obvious faces right here. Benjamin Franklin, we know him from the $100 bill. Patrick Henry, my good friend. And Andy, who else is here?
Okay, well, over here is Samuel Adams, who was one of the most active members of Sons of Liberty in protesting, and John Adams, his cousin, who was also against them. Yeah, the Sons of Liberty were basically a group that basically protests the British, like at any time they were, which became popular like within the last decade.
Certainly. Protest. All right.
Yes.
Now on to Lexington and.
Okay, in 1775, the British sent General Gage to Boston to become the new governor, basically, because the American colonists were getting a little rowdy, basically. Well, maybe more a little, like. So, to try and calm things down, the British thought they would send more soldiers over there. So they sent Gage and some troops to Boston, which were greeted by some militiamen, which afterwards the yes, okay, so another thing, the general was sent to like receive ammo stores in Lexington and Concord, which was part of militia. It was used to fund guns and stuff, and basically they marched over to seize the ammo stores, and when they got to Lexington, they're originally greeted by like 80 like soldiers, which were like panicky, didn't know what to do, and they were the first casualties of the war. Okay, then they proceeded to Concord, where the first fighting of the war like really started.
All right. So the results of the Lexington and Concord battle resulted in the Second Continental Congress, which resulted in Thomas Paine's Common